Hello, my glorious asynchronous undergraduates. I am happy to tell you that this is, I forget which week it is technically for us, but it is also the week where we're going to talk about assessment, which is a huge chunk of your lesson plan. So, let's just get right into it. Okay, so if you want to pause a minute and think about this, totally happy to let you do that. Right, so think of and list as many forms of assessment as you can, and then group them by any type that you decide. So, any way you can think of that we figure out how kids learn or if they've learned. At this point, you may pause the video and think about it if you choose to. If not, we're going to continue onwards. Okay, so what are some types of assessment? A ton of the things that we normally do in a classroom that you maybe don't even think of as assessment are actually assessments. Here is a ginormous list of all the things that technically count as assessments. You'll notice that tests and exams and quizzes are on there, which is definitely stuff you would expect to be on a list of assessments. But also there's things like exit tickets, skits and songs, think, pair, share activities, reflective journals, projects and presentations. All of these things are things that are designed to let you know whether or not your students are actually learning, which is the whole point of assessment. Okay, so when we're thinking about assessments, what we often do is something called backwards design. Basically, when you're planning a unit, you tend to think in terms of what do I want my students to be able to do or accomplish by the end of this unit? And you're usually going to have to do some sort of an assessment at the end of the unit to make sure that the students met your goals for the unit, right? So, start by planning the assessment. Decide what you're going to do for the big assessment at the end of the unit, and then work your way back from there. Because generally you want to make sure that your assessments fit what you're actually teaching in class. And that there's no weird discrepancies between the work that you did in class or the kind of practice that you did in class and how you actually grade the kids on whether or not they learned it later on. So stage one, identify your desired results. To go back to, let's say, the example I gave in the lesson plan video, if you haven't watched that or been in one of my little meetups where we talked about that, then you may need to think about this a little more. But so my example in the lesson plan was if I was going to do like middle school social studies and we were doing a lesson on voting, right, which is a bigger part of a unit on like government and how the government works. Well, maybe my final project is that the students in groups have to get together and create a plan for a fictional government in a fictional country that they, made up, right? And in that, they have to tell me, like, what the process is for voting people into office. So if that's my desired result, that they're going to be able to do this project, then I need to think hard about what things I have to do during the unit and what things I have to have them practice to get to where they can actually do that independently or with a little help, right? And then stage 2 with an assessment is determining acceptable evidence. Like, what would be acceptable evidence that they really did learn, how government works. That project could be acceptable evidence. I could have them write a paper about it. It's kind of weird I don't know that I would do that for middle school necessarily. It depends. I could have them make videos about what they learned. There's all kinds of things I could do, but I have to determine what would be acceptable evidence. And then the next stage is to plan the learning experiences or the activities that students will do that leads up to that assessment. like maybe I'm going to have them learn about how voting works in other countries. Maybe I'm going to have them do a whole lot of research on different types of democracies, like a representative democracy and a parliamentary democracy and things like that. All those activities should theoretically lead up to the major assessment at the end. Okay, so when we're evaluating learning, remember that assessment methods should reflect the intended outcome or objectives. They should also reflect the instructional strategies you actually use in your class. And they should occur prior to, during, and after instruction. Okay, so when we're talking about assessment, the definition that we like to use is the process of observing a sample of a student's behavior and drawing inferences about the student's knowledge and abilities. So, there's a couple of different ways to approach an assessment. You can have an informal assessment, which is what it sounds like. It's spontaneous day-to-day observations that happen in the classroom when you're sort of letting the students do activities. And then there are formal assessments, which is really more what most people think of when we say assessment, like a test, a project, right? So those are planned in advance, you use them for a specific purpose, and they are very systematic, right? So there's usually a rubric or a checklist or something of that nature that helps you keep track of whether or not the students have learned what you need them to learn. Okay. Assessments also come in formative or summative. So a formative assessment is generally a daily classroom assessment. It's something you would do on the regular. The idea is you use that to plan for and also to improve your instruction. So it's basically a little check-in to make sure that the students are with you and that they're getting the information. And if you find that they are, that's great. Continue with the plan as, you originally saw it. And if for whatever reason they're not, that gives you an opportunity to, change course a little bit, figure out how you want to continue and adjust, right? So, informal assessments usually tend to be formative. It's just supposed to, give the kids a chance to grow and improve, basically. These are not usually ginormous grades in your grade book. They're usually they can be as simple as, one of the things I used to do in Spanish class was, put a sentence on the board and then give them a couple of blanks to fill in the sentence. And then they would fill in the blanks with the appropriate vocabulary words, like on a whiteboard or something, like a small whiteboard. And then I would have everybody hold up their answers, or I would walk around and look at everybody's answers on their desks to see if they were getting it. We didn't take a grade on that, obviously. It was just a little check-in, but that definitely counted as a formative / informal assessment. A summative assessment, however, is kind of more of a big deal, a little more high stakes. So in that case, you're summarizing what a student has learned over a given period of time. So that might be over the unit, between the beginning of class and the midterm, between the beginning of class and the final. Entrance exams count as this, professional language tests count as this. Yeah, they tend to be bigger, more structured, high stakes tests for a score or for a grade. And yes, those generally tend to be formal, planned assessments. Right, so here's just a little bit more about formative and summative assessments. The idea of a formative assessment, which again, you're doing as you're trying to get your students to learn, not at the end of the learning, is where you should be able to identify, what they're doing well and what they're really catching on to. What knowledge they have, and if there's anything they're thinking that's like a misconception or that is kind of not right. It's a good place for you to find that out and correct it. And then, it's just about progress and monitoring their growth, basically. It doesn't have to be anything bigger than that. But a summative assessment is generally conducted at the end of instruction. And it's just to see, their final, this is where they got to after all that instruction. So these are big class grades usually. And often we use those summative assessments to determine like where students go from here. Like do they go on to Algebra 2 after geometry? Do they go on to, AP US history instead of just straight up US history? A lot of things like that are determined through assessments. Right? So, really, generally, a lot of teachers will follow this pattern of a diagnostic assessment, which happens before you learn. That's a pretest, or some kind of thing that you do to see what students already know about a topic. Sometimes the answer is absolutely nothing. Sometimes the answer is they know some things, but really they're not very well versed in this particular topic. That is absolutely important for a teacher to know. Because it gives you a baseline to know where to start from. Like, oh, everybody here seems to know the difference between being elected and appointed to a government office. I guess I don't really have to cover that. We can move on to the next stage, right? And then, of course, the formative is during learning, and the summative is after the learning occurs. Okay, so here are some more examples of different things that count as, like, formative or summative assessments. They also have a category interim assessment. They're all just formative assessments, let's be real. Right? So we don't go over that because you can read it if you want to take a look at it. Yeah, and here's the Venn diagram of where these things cross over or don't. And there's a ton of examples of what a formative assessment can be and what a summative assessment could be. I don't want to focus on those so much, so we're going to ignore the pink and the blue, and we're only going to look at the similarities in the middle. Obviously, both are ways to assess. Hello, obviously. Questioning strategies need to be addressed for both. Like, you have to think really strongly about what type of questioning you want to do for each one in order to get the results you're hoping for. And then both need to be used to evaluate a student effectively. Like, you don't want to just do summative assessments all the time. Because then you have no way halfway through the lesson of knowing whether they're with you or not, or whether they're getting anything or not. You might get some pretty nasty surprises if all you ever do is summative assessments. But if you only do formative assessments, you never get a sense of what they can finally do at the end of a unit. You can use all of these for student feedback and explanations and help. And then, of course, both of them can be used to assist in future lesson planning. Right? So here we go again. Some things that count as, formative and summative assessments. So you can have an informal formative assessment. You can also have a formal formative assessment, which is kind of hard to say. Right? So, they may be an assessment that takes place during the learning, but it's very formal. It's like, maybe it's just a quiz or something of that kind. And then, you can have informal summative assessments, some of which is there. And then you can also have what most people think of as an assessment, which would be a formal summative assessment, like a test or an exam, or an essay, that kind of thing. Yeah, so, again, as we are thinking about what counts as a formative assessment or an informal assessment, formal, summative, here are some things that fit into different categories. A formative informal assessment might be the things listed here, right? Even exit tickets count as an assessment. I know not everybody thinks of that, but they do. And then like a formal formative assessment would be something like a journal, homework, quizzes, discussions, etc. And then you have the summative informal sort of thing, which could be like a pop quiz or a class discussion. And then a formal summative, you think of projects and exams, but also like a Socratic seminar could fit into that category. Any kind of oral presentations or papers can fit into the category of a formal summative assessment. So when you start planning your lesson plan, the assessment part, feel free to look back at these lovely little charts to determine, because you do have to tell me for your assessment whether it is formal, informal, formative, summative. Feel free to look back at these charts and see where your activities might fall on them, because that would be pretty helpful for you. Right? So why assessment? Why can't we just learn cool and interesting things and talk about them? Why do we have to do an assessment, right? I often feel this way myself, mainly because grading is boring. But it does actually play a role, right? So assessment can motivate students to study and learn. You know, they want to do well on the assessment. They want to make an A. They want to impress their teacher and all of their classmates with their good work. Those things can be very motivating. They can influence a student's cognitive processes as they study, like knowing that an assessment is coming and what's going to be on it often helps students pick a direction to go in when they're studying. An assessment is a learning experience, like it or not. There are many professions where you have to take a big assessment to be allowed into the profession. For example, medicine, law, teaching. You want to be a contractor, there's an exam for that. If you want to be a nurse, there's an exam for that. Learning how to take an assessment is helpful to students in their future endeavors often. This also gives students feedback about how well they're learning. And if students decide to really get involved in the assessment process, it also encourages their intrinsic motivation and their self-regulation, which we have talked about in other chapters. So, what makes a good assessment? Because let's be real, there's some bad assessments in the world. A good assessment must be reliable. Is it really measuring what you want it to measure? And is it also doing it repeatedly for all students? Like, is it a good, reliable measurement? Good assessments are fairly standardized. That's not to me, every student should, have roughly kind of the same assessment, but obviously that's not the case if you're dealing with students who need accommodations. Good assessments should be valid. They are actually designed in a way that reflects the learning you've actually done in class, and also, they should really measure the thing they're trying to measure. So, one of the problems we have with, for example, the SAT is it's supposed to measure your potential for success in college, but studies show that that's not really what the SAT does. The SAT measures a lot of other things. It measures, for example, how good you are at the English language, as a lot of students who are language learners often struggle with the SAT. It also measures how good you are at sitting still for 4+ hours. It measures a lot of things, but the studies, and you can look it up if you like, will back me up on the fact that SAT scores are nowhere near as tightly correlated to student retention or achievement in college as they would like for us to think it is. Right? So it's not as valid as it could be. Your assessment should be practical. You can't ask students to do things that you just don't have the resources for. Like, I'm not going to ask kids to build a, glorious diorama of the Spanish Inquisition if we don't have the art supplies. That would just not be okay. So a good assessment can also, be varied. You don't have to, we said standardized, but really what we're talking about standardized is like the skills you're asking them to use are the same across the board. But the actual assessment itself can be varied for different types of learners. Like, one of my things I loved to do was give students different ways they could present to me that they knew the materials. Like, I would give them at the end of the unit the opportunity to write a paper if they wanted to make a video. I would give them the opportunity to do a presentation for the class, create a game. Same topic, and they needed to demonstrate to me the same skills, but there were a lot of different ways to get there. Right? And then, of course, your assessment needs to make sense to your students. If your directions are unclear, trust me, they will let you know it, and they will make you pay for it. So, definitely make sure that everything is clearly explained, the students know what's expected of them, and obviously it should be pertinent to the lesson. Like, actually test what you've been learning about. Sounds like common sense, but, not everybody has that. So let's talk about an idea here. Instead of a traditional IQ test, right? Let's talk about this fat head test of intelligence, right? So what if we wanted to know how smart people were, and instead of giving them an IQ test, we just measured their head, like how big their head is. And then we compared that to other people in their age group. And then we decided that people with larger heads probably had bigger IQs. Okay, is that a reliable test? Are we sure that we're gonna get the same answers every time? Like, are people with bigger heads pretty much always gonna be smarter? And then, are the test scores valid? Like, is this really measuring intelligence, or is it just measuring how big-headed people are? I would argue with you that this test is neither reliable nor valid. Right? So maybe don't try to figure out how smart people are based on the roundness of their heads. People have actually done that in history, though. They thought bigger head meant bigger brain, meant more smart. No. Not true. Okay, so, there's another couple of categories an assessment can fall under. It can be a performance assessment, where the kids show you what they can do or what they understand based on action, right? Creating something, making something, presenting something, right? So you have some examples here of like speeches and displays and science fairs, projects, proficiency portfolios, and that sort of thing. And then you have standardized tests. Excuse me if I choke a little on talking about these, because I don't really love them. These aren't norm referenced. Okay, so that means everybody gets the same instructions. Everybody gets the same time limit. Everybody has to do the same thing. Everybody gets graded the same way, right? This is why when you took the SAT or the ACT or any standardized test, your teacher or person who was giving the test had to stand up there and literally read word for word a set of instructions to you. And it was probably really boring. And you probably wanted to, run away screaming because it was so boring. And believe me, so did the person reading the instructions. I know, I've done it. But if everybody's gonna get the same instructions, then, there's this whole process of standardization where we all get the same instructions. Usually standardized testments are high stakes. We use that term high stakes to mean they are super important and they have big consequences for your life. Pretty much. Right? So a high stakes assessment would use a single score to make important decisions about students. Like schools that heavily weight SAT scores. Your SAT score determines whether you get into their school or not. Which I think is bogus, but yeah, who cares what I think. And then, you have achievement tests, general aptitude and intelligence tests, specific aptitude and ability tests, school readiness tests. All of these things kind of hang out under the category of standardized tests. Okay, so this gets a little detailed, but here we are, right? So there are different assessment types. You can have closed tasks. And here's an example of what counts as a closed task. Multiple choice, true, false, fill in the blanks, right? These are really good for assessing content, but not so good for assessing process. So, do you know information? Yes, it's good for that. But can you actually apply that information? No, not so good. Right? So, facts and skills, concepts, they usually are pretty quick to do because they're not open-ended. It's just a quick answer, and then you move on. So you may also have open tasks and constructed responses. And that means there's a possibility of different answers to every question and different processes potentially. So these are a little better for deciding whether students can interpret information and apply that information. Have them communicate how they're thinking about something and what their reasoning was behind it. So those are a little better for processes than for just straight up knowledge from content. You can add performance tasks. That's a task that, creates a product, right? We often call these authentic assessments. Sometimes they're very long project opportunities. For example, when we did our Day of the Dead unit in Spanish, I would have the students create like an altar, an ofrenda, for some famous person in the Spanish-speaking community who had died. And, that was an extended project. It took a few weeks to get that going well. And they had to, show me they could do some research and show me that they could, put together a project that was reflective of the different elements of culture we had talked about. But that was definitely something that would have fallen under performance tasks. Right, so this is you being able to see if they can organize and synthesize all that information and skills, and if they can use the resources that you've given them. An informal assessment, could be teacher observations or checklists, conversations with students. All right, so, and sometimes from those you get some idea of where a kid is coming from and what they're thinking about, where they are in terms of their understanding, etc. And then, you can also do self-assessments or reflections. These are really self-evaluations for students, or self-assessments. We just said that. So some things that might fall under that category you have here: student journals, reflection activities, teacher-student interviews, etc. So this is really where we get kids doing kind of metacognitive thinking. They're really thinking about how they're working through their work. And the different ways that they learn and think about their work. You can learn a lot about a student's personal goals from doing that. The self-reflective part is often kind of overlooked in class. Teachers tend to stick with the first 4 things on the list. But there has been a push in recent years to engage students in critical thinking by having them do a lot of reflection on their work. Whoops, sorry. Right? So this is kind of a fun little chart here. The different things that people are kind of trying to assess, the different skills, right? So knowledge versus understanding, those are 2 different things. Let's be real. I can know, for example, that a plane can fly. And I can know that that has something to do with physics and air pressure over the wings and under the wings and stuff like that, but not really understand how it works. So yeah, those are different things, right? Thinking skills, process skills, attitudes, work habits. And this lovely chart kind of gives you an idea of what sort of assessments are best for each of those skills. So wherever you see an X, that means, yeah, this kind of assessment would be great for this thing that you're trying to do. So, like, for example, if I'm trying to judge a student's knowledge, as I look through the X's, I see that red one at the bottom that says teacher-made tests, or an ideal method for that. because, I know what knowledge they're supposed to have because I taught it to them. So obviously my test would be best suited for that. But then if you're looking at process skills, they think the ideal method is observation, because I can watch them doing a thing and see if they actually know the steps to do that thing. Alright, so this is kind of a cute little chart, which you can absolutely refer back to when you're planning your assessment for your lesson plans. Right, and that's pretty much it for assessment for the moment. Right? So, things to keep in mind when you're planning your lesson plans. Because generally you want to, as we said at the beginning of this lesson, look at what you want them to be able to do at the end of the lesson for the assessment, and then plan backwards from there with your lessons. So hope that all makes sense. As always, feel free to get in touch with me if you're confused about anything. And I look forward to seeing how you incorporate these things into your lesson plans. Hope you're having a great week. Peace.